All right, let's get started, everyone. So, once again, I want to welcome you to Work Institute's webinar today, Strengthening Workforce Communities During a Crisis. Really appreciate everyone joining today. Yes, I am in an office. We are based out of Franklin, Tennessee, but I am in isolation. I'm the only person here in the office, so got out of my home and into the office today so that we could do this via video, but really appreciate everyone joining us. I hope that you and your family and your loved ones and your colleagues are safe right now and healthy. We are in extraordinary times, obviously, with everything that's going on. And I know that so many of us are struggling with kind of understanding what's happening, understanding how this is impacting our workforce. How do we come out of this? And a big part of what we're going to be talking about today is, there's still a lot of unknowns. And so this idea of strengthening our workforce communities is not just for today, but it's also for tomorrow. It's for 2 weeks from now. It's for 2 months from now. It's for a year from now, because many of the actions and many of the things that we do right now are actually going to impact our workforce for a long time to come, because this is a time during crisis when impressions are made and when people are taking note of what their leaders are doing. One of the first things I want to do is get some language right. So, one of the first things that came out around mid-March when this crisis, this COVID-19 pandemic crisis, began to really affect, the world, really, and certainly us here in the United States, but was this idea of social distancing. And, really, it would have been nice had someone from the outset kind of corrected that and said, what we need to be doing is physical distancing. The whole idea is that we need to physical distance ourselves from each other in order to curb the spread of this terrible virus. But social distancing is something very different. Social distancing is when we feel like outcasts. We feel like we're not part of the community. When we're socially distancing ourselves, we're apart. And one of the things we want to do is not feel alone. And if what kept going through my head is that when we're social distancing, I kept thinking of the social outcast, that person who feels estranged and feels like they're apart or feels like they're being abandoned. And that's the one thing that we don't want to do during a crisis and during this time. We want our community to be strong. We want our workforce to feel together. And we need to lead from that place of wanting to pull people together into the community and not be socially distancing, but physically distancing ourselves. So that's one of the really critical components of what we're going to be talking today, is that workforces and workplaces are communities. They're places where people gather. Obviously, we're getting work done, and everyone is wanting to get a paycheck. All of those things are represented as part of a workforce. But at the end of the day, it is very much a community. And in many cases, we're actually spending more time on a daily basis in that community than, say, the community of our personal life, our home, or maybe our religious affiliation, our churches, our synagogues. Those are places that also create community. But for many of us, many, many, many hours are spent in our workplace community, in our workforce community. And so during a crisis, it's one of the things that is affected significantly. And certainly we have right now the COVID-19 crisis. That's what's front of sort of top of mind. But actually here in Tennessee, we've had 2 instances of tornadoes where we've also had that crisis on top of this particular COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So, and it's, I kept thinking about how in that particular instance where we had the tornadoes, it was how many people came together, and literally within hours, there were people rushing to the scene to actually help their neighbors and to pitch in and do all those things. And this is a different crisis where we actually have to stay apart. We have to be physically distanced from each other. So, but that's what we want to do. We want to be thinking about the physical distance, not be thinking about socially distancing. So I want to first talk about what makes up this idea of, a strong workforce community. And it really, it boils down to some of those basic, we've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of need and those type of things. And I've tried to keep this simple because I think it's just, simple is good right now. We've got so much going on in our lives and so many things are affecting us that I believe simplicity is one of the things that we need to focus on. So first, I want us to think about safety. And when we think about safety, I think especially during the pandemic crisis, safety, we first think about health and all the talk of mask and personal protective equipment and all of those things. And those are all important. But people also want to feel safety in security. What's going to happen with my job? What's going to happen with my spouse's job? What's happening with my pay? I mean, we're hearing day in and day out that people are being laid off, people are being furloughed. I mean, we went from one of the historic lows in terms of unemployment to some of the highest unemployment that we've seen since the Great Depression. And so people are just feeling unsafe. They're feeling uneasy. And as leaders in our organization, we are trying to find ways to make them feel safe. Now, in this particular crisis, it has hit us in ways that no one could have expected potentially. So you have certain industries, for example, the restaurant industry. We know how hard that's been hit. And certainly there have been layoffs and there have been furloughs and people are losing their jobs. Some of that is absolutely, we're just unable to avoid it. But how we go about doing that, how we talk about the future, how we talk about how we want to bring people back, how we want to bring them back into the workforce, how much we help them in that process to be able to understand where resources are and where they can go in order to potentially sustain themselves from a day-to-day financial perspective. All of those things can create this idea of safety. And we need to make sure as employers that we're taking on that responsibility, even if we have to furlough or lay employees off, that how are we going to help to make sure that we're doing everything that we possibly can to make employees feel safe and make them feel more secure and give them some hope in many cases about what the future can look like and how we want to bring them back to work. And that is one of our goals. So we really have to think about safety. And there's a great, many of you have heard of Simon Sinek, I would hope. He does some really, really good presentations, some TED Talks. And there's a great video out there from Simon talking about how leaders create safe work environments. And it's a 12-minute video. I really encourage you to go out and watch that. I'm not going to try and repeat his stories because he's such a better storyteller than I am. But I think it's worth listening. And in some cases, they talked about not laying off employees. And I think in some cases, we've not been able to avoid that in order to have a company and to have an employer down the road. But I think so many of the things that he talks about are really important to understand this idea of safety. The second thing is this idea of connectivity or community. And, humans are social creatures and, we're profoundly impacted by those that are around us and those that we interact with. And we want that. Other than my wife, who is an extreme introvert, who says this is, one of the best times of her lives, by and large, we want to come together. We want to be around others. We want to be able to identify with that community. And again, it's oftentimes at work, but we also identify with our family and friends. We identify with our religious affiliations. All of those things create this connectivity and this community. And it's so disrupted right now. This physical distancing is requiring us to disrupt that. So how are we going to create that sense of community? How do we still get people to be able to come together? Obviously, video conferencing has become a huge part of what we're trying to do, because just the idea of being able to see each other, not just hear each other, but see each other, is such a critical part of that. And here at Work Institute, we've been having twice a week meetings for just 30 minutes where we're all getting on our Zoom feeds and we're able to see each other and we're able to talk to each other and just make sure that we're all feeling okay about the things that are going on. And you're hearing about other organizations that are doing the same thing, and either it happens in their departments or it happens in larger gatherings. And I think that some of the technology that's available is allowing us to have more and more people participating in these video conference events and meetings. And so it's one of the things that we need to do in order to take advantage of how do we create this idea of community? How do we keep people socially together, not socially distanced, but socially together? Because that's the key to this idea of community, is that we have to do that part. And then lastly, Maslow talks about, self-actualization, but it really comes down to purpose. What is it that our purpose is? And our purpose really gets lost in this crisis in many cases. And what we can often do as employers is say, what are we going to do in order to kind of redefine our purpose, maybe even just for a short period of time? We're seeing so many manufacturers be able to step in and build personal protection equipment and do different things in order to fulfill a different short-term purpose. But those things are so critical. Here at the Work Institute, obviously as workplace and workforce experts, we're trying to do everything we can with our clients and with those that we interact with, of trying to help them figure out what's going on in your workplace and what's happening and how can we be helpful in that particular instance. So it's just so critical that we understand either our long-term purpose or we understand what our actual short-term purpose is, because we want to be giving people a place to move forward. I do see a couple of questions talking about the TED Talk. Again, if you do a Google, you don't even have to Google search, go to YouTube, type in Simon Sinek, and then Simon Sinek on leaders creating a safe work environment or safety in the workplace. So I think that will that will pull up the one, and like I said, it's 12 minutes long. And so that's, again, it's a really, really good video. So I want to start this idea with saying, if we're going to build a strong workforce community right now, it's about safety, it's about connectivity, it's about creating a sense of purpose of what we're trying to do. The other thing I want us to then sort of take on this idea is that think about it in change management. And when we think about change management, we think of creating this big change. We think of, how are we going to change a significant system? How are we going to change a significant process? And in building or rebuilding this workforce community, we need to be thinking of this change management in very short-term ideas, that there's this, it's almost like a continuous improvement change model that we need to be going through. And there's really three elements of that. First is awareness, second is choosing what to do, and then third is actually changing or taking that action. And I want to get into each of those in a little bit more detail. First of all, we need to think about awareness. And again, we've talked about how people feel, but there's this sense of uncertainty. There's a sense of stress. There's change going on. We have productivity declines. What we need to be able to do is to be aware of how employees are feeling. We need to understand what are their current needs, what are they currently, their resource constraints, what are hindrances to allowing them to be productive or to do their work. What are we asking them to do different than what they would normally do? And if we appropriately trained them, have we appropriately given them the information that they need to do something different during this time? So all of those things are things that we need to be aware of. So one of the things that we need to do is have courage to raise the subject. And it's a tough subject. Obviously, being able to acknowledge this crisis, acknowledge how difficult things are and what's going on in our workplaces is something that we have to really focus on. And so we have to have the courage to ask the question, to raise the subject. And when we do that, it gives employees an opportunity to provide feedback. And we need to ask the tough questions about, do you have the resources that you need to do the job? Do you have things in your personal life that we can help with that might make things easier right now? How are we doing as an employer? How is your supervisor doing? We need to be asking those questions, and we need to be asking them in a way that allows employees to tell us what's important. Some of our sort of traditional survey methods, we tend to think that we know all the answers. We know all the things that could be affecting employees. And I think in this particular instance, we just don't know. We don't know how people are going to react or feel or how they're going to perceive things. So we've got to be able to ask this in some broader, open-ended ways. And this is an area where certainly we can help you. It's kind of one of the core philosophies around how Work Institute operates. So if you want to talk about how we can do those things, by all means, just give me a call and we'll talk about it, or give you some pointers and tips, or maybe even help you ourselves so we can figure that out. And then, and then lastly, what we want to be able to do is to make decisions. And in making those decisions, we have to look at it through a return on investment. But I don't want to think about it in terms of financial investment. I want us to think about it in terms of resources or commitment, or what are the things that we have to do differently. That all is sort of this fulcrum, if you think about it in terms of how we make decisions in an organization, and how are we going to go back and base those decisions on the return on investment to create community? How are we going to make people feel safe? How are we going to make them feel connected? And that's really what we need to be looking at in terms of how we're making decisions. And I want to pause for just a second here and talk about leadership for a second, because I think that, again, Simon does a great job, but I talked a lot about this webinar with Dr. Tom Mahan. Tom obviously founded the Work Institute 20 years ago, and Tom's a psychologist by training. And so we've talked a lot about this content. Even though it's short, we had, really hours of conversations around it. And we kept talking about leadership, and we kept talking about what good leaders do. And the image that kept coming to Tom was this idea of a sailboat. And it came to him that right now leaders are the keel. And the keel is all about not letting the sailboat tip over. It's what gives it stability. And that's what leaders have to be able to do, is they have to be able to give people a sense of stability in this extraordinarily difficult time. And that's what human resources can do. Human resources, I know a lot of you are in HR that are on this particular webinar. So we need to be able to be the keel in the organization. And so we need to be able to give it stability. And in doing that, this raising the subject and getting feedback, and then the decisions that we make, and thinking through that decision process through this idea of what's going to create a sense of stability, what's going to create stability and people feeling safe, and people feeling part of this community. That's so much about what this is about. And I know it sounds oversimplified to some degree, but it's really what we need to be doing right now. We just need to be intentional about it, and we've got to be committed to doing that. And then once we figure out how and what those decisions are going to be, then we need to put action into place. And how do we define success around that? And it needs to be simple. We need to be doing so many small, simple things. I hate to bring up a coworker, but we are obviously all working from home, and one of my coworkers couldn't feel she was not as productive without both of her screens. We all work with 2 or 3 or 5 or 12 screens now. So it's happy to take those and drop them off on her doorstep so that she could be more productive at work. Those are just little simple interventions. And in some cases, they're going to need to be sort of enterprise solutions, and other times they're going to need to be simple individual intervention that occur. And that's where, again, we've got to be able to understand what those needs are. So I go back to this idea that we've got to be communicating, that we have to be getting feedback from our employees. If you're in a small organization, maybe that can be one-on-one conversations with a manager. But when we're in larger organizations, maybe we need to be doing some type of survey where we can get feedback, get it quickly, and then be able to consume that information and figure out what needs to be done on an enterprise basis, but also what needs to be done at an individual level in order to help people to feel safe, help them feel a part of the community, and certainly feel that there's a purpose that we're trying to fulfill right now in this difficult time. And don't worry that the small things aren't going to feel significant, because if we do what's reasonable, and if we communicate the reasonableness of the things that we're doing, people appreciate it, and they appreciate transparency in what's going on. And so that's, everything is, employees understand that there are resource constraints, that there are financial constraints. What they want is honesty. They want transparency. They'll understand that there are links that sometimes you can't go to that you would like to, but being transparent about those, and then talking about the reasonable things that can be done. You know, a lot of companies are talking about small pay cuts so that that everyone kind of shares in a little bit of the pain, if you will, but it still is able to help them to maintain this sense of community and a certain level of security. So keep in mind, we want to define the success, meaning define what is the intention around some of the changes that we're going to make or the decisions we're going to make. Simple, make them quick, make them easy, simple interventions that we can do in our organization, and then be transparent about what's reasonable. And then here's the hard part. Then you got to do it all again, because this has got to be a continuous process. You know, this might be something we need to be doing weekly or every other week. Keep in mind, we don't know the duration of how long we're going to be sheltering at home or physically distancing. We just simply don't know right now. And there's certain things that are going to linger potentially for months, maybe large gatherings like sporting events or religious gatherings, large meetings, conferences. We don't know how long those things are going to be hindered by this virus. So we need to be doing this over and over again as often as we can so that we're constantly getting input, because things can change overnight. We've seen it day in and day out, what we think is happening for us individually. You know, maybe somebody got furloughed, but they were getting pay, and then all of a sudden 3 weeks later something happens to their spouse, and that they're no longer going to be getting an income, and so that changes their perception overnight. So all this is a continuous change that's going on, so we've got to be able to do this over and over again. And one of the things that leaders, and I think especially us in HR, are going to feel right now is something that the literature talks about in terms of compassion fatigue. And let me tell you a couple of things about it. We're going to feel constantly overwhelmed. Leaders are going to feel overwhelmed. We're going to feel as though we can't do enough. And that's okay. It's okay to feel that way. But we got to recognize it in ourselves. And we also have to recognize that people are going to, it's going to take them a while to understand their own perception. And so it's almost like grief. It's that people grieve in different ways and in different time frames. And so this doing it over and over again are going to be able to give people an opportunity to sort of speak up when they feel it. And so we may feel like we're having to say things over and over again and talk to people about how, communicate the same thing over and over and over again. And it gets frustrating. We've all been there. We feel like we've said something at least 6 times during maybe a merger and acquisition, or doing it during a different crisis, and we feel like we've said it, and we've said it again, and we've said it again, and that people haven't, they're just not listening. Well, maybe they're listening, but they're just not hearing it because they're not ready to hear it. They're going through their own issues related to this safety and to this connectivity. So we have to be willing to this idea of kind of rinse and repeat. We've got to keep doing it over and over again because different people are going to hear at different times. So we can't get fatigued in that process. We've got to be able to be strong, and we've got to be strong leaders, and we've got to just be keeping on task, and then coming and keep climbing that hill over and over again. This is what it's going to take. And again, we don't know how long this crisis is going to continue. There are signs obviously out there that things are starting, the curve is flattening, and things may get back on track. But we know for some it might be sooner. Some states have fewer cases, and then we have places like New York and New Jersey who are, life is going to be different for a long time. And we want to be compassionate to those folks. But we need to find our inner strength as leaders to be willing to lead through this process. And in doing so, we have to take care of ourselves, but we can't get fatigued by how our employees and how those are around us are reacting to this. So I hope that you've really gotten something out of this webinar. Again, I want you to think about this in terms of keeping things simple, giving people a sense of safety, everything we can do to communicate in that process. Make sure that we are doing everything we can to foster a sense of community, and that we don't talk about social distancing, that we talk about physical distancing, and that way that people can still feel a part of something. And then how do we define our short-term purpose? How do we make sure that people still feel like we're moving forward? Because people want to move forward, they want to move, they want to grow. And so how can we find those opportunities? And then we got to make sure that we're being courageous, raising the subject, asking the question, that we're getting feedback from those of our employees, whether that be one-on-one feedback, whether that be through surveys, pulses, whatever seems to fit in your organization. And then we're making decisions and making those and communicating those decisions effectively, and keeping in mind the ROI and how do we weigh those options around those community issues, and then being willing to be reasonable and transparent about them. So thank you very much for joining today. Really appreciate it. I'm here to talk. This is something that I am a student of workforces. I've been studying them for a long time. Group dynamics is something that just fascinates me. So if you just want to talk, feel free to give us a call here at the Work Institute. My contact information is on my LinkedIn profile. You can go to our website. You can reach out to me, and I'd love to talk to you if you just want to talk. Sometimes we just need to have a conversation. So be safe out there. I hope that your employees are feeling safe. Be intentional about creating a sense of community in your workforce, and hope everybody has a good weekend. Thank you so much.